three things that really stood out to me about Success Beyond the Classroom. The first was really the soft skills and growth mindset that a concept that the classroom encouraged. So I think that Success Beyond the Classroom is really unique in the AFM offering in that it helps you think about yourself as a person and what you want from your career, like what actually brings you joy, what sparks creativity, how you would think about approaching failure, building resilience. This is a rare opportunity to take a soft skills class in a somewhat sometimes finance heavy school. I think really questioning who you are as a person and what you want from your career at this stage in your career, so early in your trajectory, is an invaluable experience. I think it teaches you the skills that you'll use throughout your career. I think throughout your career, it's important to pause and reevaluate because you change as a person. Think about who you are, what you want from life, what you want from your career. And Success Beyond the Classroom really gives you the foundational tools to do that successfully. The second thing I'll talk about is just opening students' eyes to new opportunities. I think the range of speakers that the class brings in are wonderful because they're people who all started from the same point, all graduated from AFM or the MAC program, and then went on to do such a broad range of things. And I think that really opened up and inspired students to think about career paths beyond the ones that seem like the obvious choice. And even if they have signed an offer back or they're going back to a specific company, it helped them encourage them to think about where they could go next. And I think it's important to think early on about what a future path may look like. It may not all come to fruition depending on various factors at play, but having that foresight to think ahead can be really valuable in shaping the kinds of projects you take on, the kinds of things you do with your life, the kinds of skills you pick up. And so I think Success Beyond the Classroom really gathered a really unique group of alumni to showcase what's possible after AFM. The other really unique thing that I found about Success Beyond the Classroom was how open-ended it is and how the students can really direct what flow the conversation takes. I really respected the professor's approach to having the students just open-ended ask any questions that are on their mind. It made for one of the most unique conversations I've ever had with a group because it wasn't super structured and it really surfaced the questions that were top of mind for them. And there were no boundaries. They were allowed to ask any questions that were on their mind, which I found really energizing. And honestly, when I walked away from the class, it was an opportunity for me to reflect on my own journey as well. And so I think it was inspiring for all involved. I walked away really energized as well. And it's just a really unique environment to have a class that is quite so open-ended. So all that to say, I was a big fan of the class and maybe will be involved myself in the year ahead.